Well, it looks like the Russians are starting to get a little bit antsy about the coming arrival of F-16s to Ukraine, so much so that some of them are talking about shooting down NATO aircraft over the Black Sea or striking air bases inside of NATO territory. So, of course, we're going to talk about that, as well as the ongoing Russian offensive in Harkiv and some new interesting data kind of breaking down the statistics of the casualties sustained by the Russian Wagner Group. But first and foremost, we're going to push back on some fear-mongering that kind of took hold over the past couple days. Russian warships in Cuba. This is nothing at all to be concerned about. It's normal activity. It's happened in the past. It's going to happen in the future. It's part of a regularly planned exercise, in fact. And since the moment that these ships arrived in the Atlantic, they've been under the watchful eye of the United States and multiple of our allies. Now that they're in and around Cuba, they're being shadowed by U.S. and Canadian military vessels with countless aircraft overhead. It's nothing, again, to be concerned about at all. This is essentially Russia using this exercise as a way to show that they have the ability to project military power anywhere around the world. So don't believe all the hype that this is some major escalation or a move in that direction. This is normal activity all the way around. Now, moving to the F-16 topic, there's a couple different ways to start in on this, but I wanted to start with this topic of these jets being stored outside of Ukrainian territory, because there's some truth to that. Ukraine has said they're going to do that, but I think it's being misrepresented in some Russian Telegram channels and some Russian media, making it seem like these jets are going to be stored for strike missions outside of Ukraine to hit Russian targets and then fly back to NATO territory. And there's no real, I'd be surprised if that is how these are utilized. So a senior Ukrainian Air Force commander published comments this past Sunday saying that some of the F-16s delivered by European allies to Ukraine will be held at foreign bases while military personnel continue to train on them. Now, at a high level, as a reminder, Belgium, Denmark, Netherlands, and Norway have committed to providing Ukraine more than 60 F-16s, but those are staggered out over a couple of years. Some of them are years down the road before the delivery will be made. The earliest I've heard is the end of this year. I would expect this is how it's played out with most new weapon systems arriving in Ukraine. We say December 31st, and sometime in October, November, maybe even early December at the latest, that weapon system is in theater conducting operations to kind of catch the Russians off guard for a period of time. But either way, they're not there now, should be sometime in the coming months. Now, this senior Ukrainian official said there is a number that will go to Ukraine, and there's a certain number of aircraft that will be stored at secure air bases outside of Ukraine so that they cannot be targeted here. And we're going to get into that more here in a second, because there has been some video released just in the last couple days showing Ukrainian aircraft being struck on airfields pretty far inside of their own territory. Now, this official said that the planes held back will remain in areas where the pilots and the crews can continue to conduct training, and those will be used as kind of a form of reserve. In case any of the jets get shot down or there's any maintenance issues, and the jets that are forward, they can kind of swap these out with those that are continuing to conduct training and maintenance somewhere in the rear. Now, the way that this was perceived by some Russian channels looking at two majors, a major Russian Telegram channel, he said this is like a chess game and what you would call a fork. On the one hand, you can strike at air bases with uncertain effectiveness. Strikes on distant airfields of the Ukrainian armed forces have proven this, and NATO has AWACS aircraft constantly on duty, which simplifies the early detection of missile launches. So kind of saying you could strike some of these NATO air bases, but it's going to be hard, right? The further away the target is, the harder it is to go undetected and successfully strike it. Two Major says, on the other hand, leave this as a fact and work to destroy aviation in other ways. But at the same time, we demonstrate weakness in the eyes of the West, which is what the alliance is counting on as part of increasing degree of escalation. So saying if we don't strike these airfields in NATO territory and try to destroy these aircraft over Ukrainian land, we're going to look weak. We have to take action to strike the source of where these aircraft are coming from. They added, and this was across a couple different Russian channels, adding that there's speculation that these F-16s stored in foreign territories like Poland, Romania, or elsewhere are going to be the ones equipped with the longest range U.S. weapon systems. So they can, essentially, this kind of the idea that they're presenting, they're going to fly from, say, Poland into Ukrainian airspace towards the Eastern Front, conduct these strikes, and then turn around and fly back to, the NATO air base, wherever that might be. I would be surprised if that's how these aircraft are utilized. That incurs a lot of risk for the NATO countries wherever these airfields are going to be located, and would be a significant form of escalation, right? It's one thing to provide Ukraine with the weapon systems that their personnel operate. It's a whole different ballgame to allow your territory to be used to launch strikes directly into either Russian territory or Russian-occupied portions of Ukraine. Additionally, one of the major concerns from the moment that any aid started arriving in Ukraine is Russia has been saying that these are NATO military forces, right? They're being operated by the U.S. or Germany or Poland or the U.K., whoever it might be. If there's aircraft taking off from Poland with a Ukrainian flag on it, conducting strikes and then flying back, it's very hard to convince Russia that those are Ukrainian pilots. So my expectation with how this plays out is there will be some stored in foreign airfields because it makes sense, and we'll get to why here in a second. But for any that are conducting active operations, they're going to be taking off and landing inside of Ukraine to make that abundantly clear that these F-16s are being operated and the strikes are being conducted by Ukrainian forces, not elements of NATO. Now, it makes sense, again, to want to store some of these F-16s outside of the country. Again, they're not 60 arriving at one time, so they're going to be kind of staggered. But we have seen just in the last couple of days multiple videos coming out from Russian sources showing that they've taken out at least one Su-25 and one Su-27 at Ukrainian airfields inside of Ukrainian-held territory, right? So now these are both in the eastern part of the country. They're not in the westernmost portions of Ukraine. But even so, it shows that Russia is more and more able to conduct precise, relatively on-call strikes deep inside of Ukrainian territory, specifically targeting some of these airfields. So if you have a platform that you only have a handful of, like the F-16, it makes sense that you're not going to put them as forward as possible, where they're going to come under fire from Lancet, Iskanders, or anything else. But also, understandably, you might want to store some outside of the country. Now, given that opportunity exists. Now, there's a good conversation to be had here about would those NATO airfields be legitimate military targets? And the short answer is yes. Any military airfield makes for a legitimate military target, regardless of what they're doing, right? It's a military facility. The challenge here is not whether or not a Russian strike on one of those airfields would be a legitimate military target. Would it be worthwhile for Russia to carry that out, risking, an Article 5 escalation or multiple NATO countries striking back? That's really the question here. So it's not, is it legal? Is it justified? It would be justified at baseline, especially if there's fighter aircraft taking off from one of these airfields, conducting strikes against Russian forces. That 100% makes it a viable target. That's not really the question. The question is, does it make sense? Is the trade-off worth it for Russia to carry out that strike? But that also is why I don't think that's probably how these are going to be used, because it kind of forces a red line there towards further escalation that I don't think NATO, the United States, and others are really looking for. Now, over the last couple of days, we have seen kind of an increase of Ukrainian strikes, long-range strikes with Storm Shadows, mostly ATACMS, into Crimea, taking out air defense radars and air defense missile systems. Just a couple days ago, there were reports that several S-400 and S-300 crews were destroyed in Crimea, and this got to the Russian Wagner Group, pretty rough organization, and they're not happy, and put out a note on Telegram saying, what could air defense losses in Crimea grow into? Most likely, the F-16 will actively work on the peninsula, since in the future, military units, government buildings, fuel reserves, strategic infrastructure, and much more will be under attack from air weapons of Western fighters. So they're kind of indicating that what they view is going to happen here is the taking out of air defense assets in Crimea is just kind of paving the way for that to be the prime target for the F-16s when they arrive in theater. They say, obviously, the production rate does not in any way cover the current level of losses, so a solution must be found here and now. And the only correct way out of the situation will be the destruction of NATO long-range warning aircraft and RQ-4 Global Hawk UAVs over the Black Sea. So the only way to stop this is to target NATO aircraft over the Black Sea. They say the United States has already crossed all the red lines, the last of which was to ban strikes on Russian territory. No one will take revenge for one drone or even several AWACS pilots. They added playing defensively is obviously doomed to failure, and the sooner this is understood, the better. So I would disagree. I think AWACS pilots getting shot down, American troops being killed by Russian forces while they're flying in international airspace over international waters, I think that would probably spark some sort of response. I think it's I think they're misreading that quite a bit. The other part here is notable that Rusich refers to what Russia is doing right now as playing defense. They view Russian forces on the defensive right now. There's a couple different ways to interpret that, but I think it's hard to view what Russia is doing right now in any portion of Ukraine as purely a defensive setup, right? Now, in talking about air defenses, there's an interesting aspect here where the deterioration of an enemy's air defense network is something that happens very slowly and then very quickly, right? It can be a rolling effect. So if you think about the challenges of trying to penetrate an air defense network, sometimes getting that first munition through, whether it's a missile or an aircraft, to strike a target is the most challenging, right? And it kind of reduces the enemy's coverage. Over time, as that coverage reduces, as more S-300s, S-400s, and their radar systems are destroyed, it becomes much more of a permissive environment to where you can start knocking out these radars like we're seeing right now on a pretty regular basis. Now, that's not to say that there's no air defense in Crimea or that in some point in the near future there would be no air defense in Crimea, but it would not be surprising at all to see this kind of quickly escalate to the point where we're seeing every day or every other day significant air defense assets throughout Crimea or other portions of Russian-occupied territory being taken out, kind of paving the way for, whenever these F-16s do arrive in theater. Now I want to turn to the operations in Harkiv, the northern portion of Ukraine. This is the Russian offensive. I'm going to pull up a map here to give you an idea of what we're looking at. This red area here between Belgorod and Harkiv is where Russia kicked off an offensive few weeks ago, and by and large, it's pretty much stopped. The fighting is still ongoing, but we're not seeing the rapid progress that Russia made in the first few days there. And I want to turn to what looked to me, at least, like an optimistic view from the Ukrainian perspective that I think might be a little premature, but widely circulated, felt like it was worth getting into here. So this was presented by the account Tender, Tendar, not the other Tender, on X, and he said that, quote, from a tactical point of view, Russians didn't make any noteworthy gains. Vovchansk continues to be primarily under Ukrainian control, and in fact, Ukrainians have already regained some previously lost parts. The Russian dream to come any closer to Kharkiv city itself in order to position tubed artillery in range of Ukraine's second largest city is but only a fever dream. So even this tactical objective of the Russian army is nowhere near to materialize. So that was one of the, getting Kharkiv within tube artillery range was one of the disputed objectives of what was happening here. You see at the closest here, on or about Russian forces around 23 kilometers away. Really, you're talking about 20 kilometers and less to be able to mass tube artillery of a couple different calibers to kind of bring an area under continuous fire, right? Similar to how we saw it play out in Bakhmut, Avdiivka, and elsewhere. That was one of the arguments. There's also the argument about a buffer zone. There's the argument about pulling troops from elsewhere, and we're going to get into a couple more of those here in a moment. But yeah, as of now, they have not reached within tube artillery range of Harkiv. The assessment there continues, saying much more important, however, is the strategic situation. Again, Russians couldn't break the Ukrainian lines and are now even compelled to defend the area. Far worse are the political implications of that advance. The biggest Russian miscalculation has been that the West authorized the usage of Western weapons against Russian targets in Russia, not only exposing countless Russian targets, but also Russian bluffs when it comes to red lines. I'm going to pull up a satellite image here that I came across showing that it does look like Russia is digging in portions along the Harkiv front, which is notable, right? There's kind of hasty fighting positions and then something you build out a little more robust over time. Hard to tell exactly from satellite imagery, but these look like Russia is digging in, planning on holding this portion of the front for a significant while, not continuing to advance. So, interpret that a couple different ways. Maybe they achieved what they wanted to, right? They went as far as they wanted to, and they were just trying to create a little buffer zone or maybe kick off fighting in another portion of the front. But if you're talking about a further advance towards the city of Kharkiv, it's hard to square that with digging significant entrenchments and defensive positions along the current line of contact. The assessment here continues, saying there was also the assumption that the Kharkiv incursion was a diversion for operations in the east. And indeed, Russians tried multiple times to advance near Chasiv Yar, but the results were even smaller than before the Kharkiv incursion. Russians haven't spent all of their cannon fodder there yet, but if Kharkiv was a diversion, then this intention failed as well. And I want to, maybe I think that's still up for debate, really. Chasiv Yar, it's looking very similar in a lot of ways to the fight around Bakhmut, where it's just incredibly grinding, and there's not been a lot of progress here, especially along the canal for quite a while. This area, Russia's been fighting for weeks. They're under, especially Chasiv Yar is under intense aerial bombardment and artillery bombardment now, but these lines haven't largely changed all that much. But there are other areas at the front, and if you move down to Avdiivka, and we'll play a little bit of a time lapse here, this area of the front has changed quite a bit. If we just go back to the beginning of June, even. So Russia is making gains down here, advancing through territory. You can argue that it's not a lot, but it's a lot more than they were just a few months ago. So again, looking at this assessment, I don't know that you can entirely write off the fact that pulling troops from other places didn't happen, and Russian forces have not been able to advance in other areas, because they have been slowly advancing in some areas of the front, just not any sort of major breakthrough, which is kind of how this war has generally played out over the last couple of years. And wrapping up, Tinder here says, when nothing changes and when comparing those meager results with the huge resources Russia has allocated and eventually squandered, then we can easily call this a strategic Russian defeat. I think that's way too optimistic to refer to the most I've heard is around 50,000 Russian troops took part in this offensive in and around Harkiv. To say that in this war, it's not even an offensive, right? A push, an operation with 50,000 that only achieved maybe some of the objectives, to call that a strategic failure, I think is a bridge too far, probably a little overly optimistic. I would say at this point, it's way too early to judge the effectiveness of what Russia is necessarily trying to do here. Now, from the Russian perspective, War Gonzo said at the Kharkiv front, the situation is difficult. The units of the armed forces of Ukraine deployed from other directions, as well as a large number of drones, give the Ukrainians the opportunity, if not to seize the initiative completely, then to at least counterattack. And two majors added to this earlier today, saying fierce fighting continues in the Harkov direction in the village. Vovchansk, in the eastern part of the city, the enemy in groups of up to 100 people has been attempting to attack our positions since yesterday morning. So again, it's far from over, the fighting in and around Harkiv, especially in this eastern portion. It seems like there's a lot of Ukrainian counteroffensives in and around Vovchansk. But I would hesitate to kind of put any bow on this and say we know exactly how this is going to play out or what this means for the larger war. It's definitely the middle of the ongoing battle at this point. Now, there was a pretty interesting article came out just a couple days ago on June 10th in BBC titled Immoral But Effective, How and at What Cost the Wagner PMC Captured Bakhmut. So this was written by Olga Ivshina. I'm going to butcher the names here, and I'm sorry, and Olga Provserova. And the focus of the article was essentially looking at the percentage of Russian soldiers, of Wagner soldiers, that were prisoners, that died. So they said that the BBC and Mediazona received a complete list with personal data of 19,547 dead Wagnerites, of which not 50% were prisoners, like Prigozhin had claimed, but 88% of the dead were prisoners taken out of the prison system and offered, fight for a little while, you might get your freedom or whatever it might be. 88% of the Wagner dead, according to this investigation, were prisoners. Now, I believe Malcontent News, who I'll link in the description below, I believe he broke this like a while ago, like over a year ago, putting this information out there. It seems like it's made its way more into kind of mainstream reporting at this point. They added through this report that 35% of the prisoners who went to the front died. So, 1/3 of the people pulled out of prisons, sent to the front, eventually died. Talking about this, they said everyone, including Russian bloggers, discussed the losses and argued whether commanders should receive medals for the capture of Bakhmut if several times more people died in the process than in the 9 years of war in Afghanistan. And getting into the tactics, and this is something we've talked about on this channel before, disposable infantry is the term that comes to mind, right? And you don't necessarily see that in the conventional Russian forces, a little bit with the Storm Z units, but this was kind of a feature of Wagner. They said the basis of Wagner's tactics when attacking Bakhmut was wave-like attacks in small groups. As Prigozhin promised, the prisoners walked in the vanguard. Prisoners were up front. They're that opening group. They said detachments made up of prisoners were sent to the Ukrainian positions first. They attacked, provoking the Ukrainian armed forces to return fire. Wagner then, the more professional elements of Wagner, or at the very least the non-prisoner elements of Wagner, would then carry out some sort of operation to try to assault that Ukrainian position. But the people out there figuring out where the Ukrainian positions were. The first ones into the breach, walking across minefields into enemy fields of fire, were prisoners over and over and over again. And in this article say it was usually the same 8 to 12 prisoners who discovered these positions and often died or were seriously wounded before the next aspect of the operation took place. So again, interesting here. We knew that prisoners made up a portion of the Wagner Group. We knew about these kind of disposable entities that were sent forward with very limited training and really no desire to keep them alive. They were simply trying to draw fire. But pretty notable in this report, again, that 88% of the Wagner deaths, according to their research, were prisoners taken out to go fight with the Wagner Group. But that's all I got for now. Of course, if interested in this or other national security subjects, be sure to check out our Substack, which is linked in the description below. A couple articles as of late talking about China. We've got one on the elections in India, Pakistan, ISI, Hezbollah in South America, and quite a bit more. Again, all linked in the description if interested. But thanks for watching, and I'll see y'all next time.